The air in the cramped office pulsed with a heat that had nothing to do with the broken air conditioner, humming feebly in the corner. Sweat beaded on Marcus's dark skin, glistening under the flickering fluorescent light as he knelt on the hardwood floor, his breath ragged and sharp. Her hands, pale, trembling, lined with the years she wore like a badge, clawed into his shoulders, nails digging through the thin fabric of his shirt, leaving red trails that burned like a secret brand. Her lips crashed against his, hungry and unyielding, tasting of bitter coffee and the salt of her own desperation, a kiss that swallowed the venom she'd spat at him for months. The desk behind them groaned as she shoved him against it, papers scattering like fallen leaves, pens clattering to the ground in a chaotic symphony of their ruin. His fingers tangled in her graying hair, pulling her closer, the strands coarse and wild between his calloused hands, as her body pressed into his, a collision of loathing and lust that set the room ablaze. She moaned into his mouth, a sound raw and guttural, torn from some hidden depth he'd never imagined she possessed, and he answered with a growl that vibrated through his chest, a sound of surrender and defiance all at once. Her skirt bunched around her hips, revealing the pale expanse of her thighs, trembling with anticipation as his hands roamed, mapping her flesh with a fervor that mocked every slur she'd ever hurled his way. The world beyond the office walls dissolved into a distant hum, drowned by the storm of their breathing, the creak of the desk, the thud of her heel hitting the floor as she kicked it free. "You're nothing," she rasped against his neck, her voice breaking, a lie wrapped in truth, and he gripped her tighter, his hazel eyes blazing with a fire that said he'd make her eat those words. Their rhythm was frantic, a tempest of limbs and hissed curses, until the phone on the desk buzzed, a sharp, insistent trill that sliced through the haze unanswered, unheeded, as they burned in the crucible of their forbidden heat. For 300 words they remained locked in that dance, a tangle of sweat and sin, the air thick with the musk of their collision. Then the narrative shifted, pulling back from the edge of their abyss, to unravel the threads that had led them here. A story that began months earlier, under a sky far less forgiving. Marcus Johnson stepped into Evelyn Carver's hardware store on a sweltering July morning, the sun beating down on the cracked pavement outside, the air inside heavy with the scent of sawdust and rust. At 25, he was a lean figure of quiet strength, his skin a deep mahogany that caught the light in a way that seemed to defy the shadows around him. His eyes, a striking hazel, held a guarded depth, framed by lashes that softened the hardness of his jaw. A jaw that clenched too often these days. He'd come looking for work, a job to pull him out of the hole life had dug for him. Evicted from his apartment, his mother's hospital bills piling up like a noose around his neck. Evelyn, 62 and wiry, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun, stood behind the counter, her pale blue eyes narrowing as they raked over him. "You're late," she snapped, her voice a whip crack, though he'd arrived 5 minutes early. "Don't expect me to hold your hand, boy. I don't run a charity." From that first day, she made her disdain clear, a venom that seeped into every interaction. "Wipe that counter again, your kind don't know clean when you see it," she'd sneer, her lips curling as she watched him scrub until his knuckles ached. "Move faster, or I'll find someone who doesn't drag their feet like they're still in the fields," she'd bark, tossing a broom at him with a force that once bruised his shin. She'd slap his hand away from the register. "Don't touch what you can't count," and dock his pay for infractions he didn't commit. Her cruelty a blade she wielded with precision. Marcus swallowed it all, his silence a shield, his pride amber buried deep beneath the ash of her words. He needed the job, needed the money, and so he endured. His sadness, a quiet weight that pressed against his ribs, his love for her a secret he barely dared acknowledge even to himself. Because he did love her. God help him, he did. It started with the way she moved, a fierce grace in her sharp gestures, the way her hands, though calloused and rough, could coax a rusted bolt free with a tenderness she never showed him. It grew in the rare moments when her mask slipped, when she'd hum an old jazz tune under her breath, her voice soft and haunting, or when she'd stare out the store window at the rain, her face softening into something almost human. He hated himself for it, for the way his pulse quickened when she leaned close to berate him, her breath hot against his ear, her scent, lavender and stale cigarette smoke lingering in his mind long after she'd stormed off. He'd lie awake at night, his tiny rented room suffocatingly small, imagining her hands on him not in anger but in want, a fantasy that shamed him as much as it consumed him. Evelyn, for her part, hid her own torment behind the wall of her prejudice. Raised in a small town 40 miles north, she'd grown up on tales of segregation and superiority, her father's voice a thunderclap in her memory. Charles Carver, a man who'd spent 10 years in prison for beating a black man half to death in a bar fight, his fists a testament to a hate he'd passed down like an heirloom. She'd swallowed it whole, those bitter lessons, and wielded them against Marcus, with a ferocity that masked the truth. She burned for him. At night, alone in her creaking Victorian house, she'd pour herself a glass of bourbon and stare at the ceiling, her body aching with a need she despised herself for. His dark skin, his quiet strength, the way his eyes met hers with a defiance that stirred her, they haunted her, a flame she couldn't douse, a sin she buried beneath layers of venom. The turning point came on a rainy October afternoon, the store empty save for the drumming of water against the roof. Marcus, mopping the floor, overheard her voice from the back room, sharp and unundid, speaking into his phone. She'd picked it up by mistake, thinking it was hers. "I can't stop thinking about him, Ruth," she confessed to her best friend, her tone raw, trembling. "That boy, Marcus, he's under my skin, and I hate it. I love him, and it's killing me." The words hit him like a punch, his mop clattering to the ground as he stormed in, his heart pounding, his body moving before his mind could catch up. She froze, phone slipping from her hand, her eyes wide with terror and longing as he crossed the room in 3 strides and kissed her hard. Desperate, a collision of everything they'd held back. She resisted for a heartbeat, then melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer as the dam broke. Their affair erupted in secret, a wildfire that consumed them both. After hours, when the store was dark, they'd lock the door and surrender to it. Her desk their battleground, the stockroom their sanctuary, their bodies a tangle of heat and shame. "I didn't mean it," she'd whisper against his chest, her voice breaking, her fingers tracing the scars her words had left. "Any of it." He'd hold her tighter, his own guilt drowned by the intensity of her touch, his love a flame that burned brighter with every stolen moment. They spoke little, their words replaced by gasps and sighs, but when they did, it was a stripping away of pretense. Her apologies, his admissions, their shared torment bleeding into one another. For weeks, they lived in that fever dream, the world beyond the store fading into a distant hum. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and theirs was no exception. The night Charles Carver returned, the air hung heavy, saturated with the sharp tang of snow and the acrid bite of gasoline, a scent that clawed its way through the icy stillness outside Evelyn's house. The wind howled through the towering pines that framed the property, their needle-laden branches swaying like sentinels guarding a past she could never outrun, a past of bitter lessons and blood-stained legacies. Inside, the bedroom glowed with the faint, trembling flicker of a single lamp perched precariously on the nightstand, its amber light spilling across the walls in jagged pools, casting shadows that danced and twisted like specters of their forbidden union. Marcus and Evelyn lay entwined on the creaking bed, their bodies slick with sweat, the sheets tangled around their limbs like a shroud they couldn't shed. Her head rested on his chest, her gray hair once meticulously pinned but now wild and unbound, spilling over his dark skin, a stark, almost poetic contrast that mirrored the chaos of their collision. His fingers traced lazy, reverent circles along the curve of her back, feeling the tremor of her flesh beneath his touch, her body still quivering from the intensity of their latest surrender, a love so fierce it bordered on violence. The silence between them was a fragile thing, punctuated only by the ragged cadence of their breaths, mingling in the warm musky air. The afterglow of fleeting sanctuary they clung to like shipwrecked survivors. Her skin, pale and weathered by decades of hardness, pressed against his, a deep mahogany that glistened faintly in the lamplight. A canvas of quiet strength marred by the invisible scars her words had carved over months. His heart thudded beneath her cheek, a steady drumbeat she felt through the thin cotton of his undershirt, now damp and clinging to his frame. She shifted slightly, her breath catching as his hand slid lower, brushing the dip of her spine, and for a moment they existed in a world apart. Untouched by the venom, the loathing, the secrets that had birthed this reckless fire. But that world shattered with the force of a gunshot, when the front door slammed open, the sound reverberating through the house's old bones like a death knell. Footsteps heavy, deliberate, carrying the weight of decades of rage, thudded through the hall, each one a hammer against the fragile piece they'd stolen. Charles's voice roared, a thunderclap that split the night. "Evelyn, where the hell are you?" She bolted upright, the sheet slipping from her grasp as her face drained of color, leaving her ashen and hollow, her hands clutching the fabric in a desperate, futile shield. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his heart slamming against his ribs, a wild, erratic rhythm that drowned out the wind's mournful wail. He stood there, half-dressed, his jeans unbuttoned, his chest heaving beneath the torn undershirt, his hazel eyes wide with a volatile mix of fear and defiance. Charles loomed in the doorway, a grizzled giant of 68, his prison-hardened frame filling the space like a storm cloud rolling over a bruised sky. His gray eyes, Evelyn's eyes, inherited but twisted by a darker fire, blazed with a fury that promised annihilation, their steely depths reflecting the lamplight in a way that made them seem almost alive with hate. His weathered face, etched with lines from years of labor and loss, twisted into a mask of revulsion as he took in the scene, his daughter half naked, her pale thighs exposed beneath the bunched hem of her nightgown. Her lover, a black man he'd have killed on sight in his younger days, standing there with sweat still beading on his dark brow. "You filthy!" The slur died in his throat, choked off by a snarl that rumbled from deep within his chest, a sound more animal than human. He lunged, his fist, a battering ram of knuckles hardened by bar fights and prison walls, connecting with Marcus's jaw in a sickening crunch that sent him crashing into the nightstand. The lamp toppled its glass shade, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards that scattered across the hardwood floor, plunging the room into a flickering semi-darkness, where the only light was the glint of Charles's unyielding rage. Evelyn screamed, a raw, piercing sound that tore through the air as she threw herself between them, her voice a broken plea. "Dad, stop, no!" Her hands flailed, grasping at his arm, her nails raking his skin, but Charles shoved her aside with a strength undimmed by his decade behind bars, sending her sprawling onto the bed, her breath hitching in a sob. Marcus staggered, blood trickling from his lip, his vision swimming as he tried to steady himself against the wall. Charles grabbed him by the throat, his fingers gnarled and rough as tree bark, tightening until Marcus's breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, his hazel eyes locked on Evelyn's in a silent cry for something he couldn't name. "You think you can touch my blood?" Charles roared, his breath hot and sour with whiskey, a stench that burned Marcus's nostrils as the older man's grip tightened, cutting off his air. Marcus clawed at his hands, his nails digging into Charles's flesh, drawing thin lines of blood that gleamed darkly in the dimness. His love for Evelyn surged through him, a fire that fueled his fight, a desperate need to protect what they'd forged in the shadows. But Charles was a storm of hate, a force of nature too vast to resist. From his belt he yanked a knife, its blade dull from years of neglect, but wickedly sharp, glinting faintly as he raised it high. Time slowed, the room narrowing to that single brutal moment as he drove the blade into Marcus's chest. Once, twice a vicious punctuation to a life he deemed unworthy. Blood bloomed across Marcus's shirt, a crimson tide that spread with terrifying speed, soaking the fabric and pooling on the floor beneath him as he crumpled, his body folding like a marionette with its strings severed. His hazel eyes, wide with shock and fading light, locked on Evelyn's in a final fleeting moment of longing and regret, a silent farewell that carried all the words they'd never spoken. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, frantic and trembling, as if she could hold his life inside him with sheer will alone. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and sticky, staining her pale skin as her sobs tore through the air, a sound so raw it seemed to shake the walls. "No, no, no," she keened, her voice breaking into fragments, her gray hair falling into her face as she bent over him, cradling his head against her chest. Charles stepped back, the knife clattering to the floor with a hollow ring, his chest heaving, his gray eyes flickering with a momentary flicker of something triumph, perhaps, or the ghost of remorse before hardening into stone once more. "You brought this on yourself," he spat, his voice a low growl that cut through her wails, but she didn't hear him, didn't care. Marcus's breath rattled, a shallow, wet sound that grew fainter with each passing second, then stilled entirely, his body growing heavy in her arms. She clutched him tighter, her screams echoing through the house, a wail of grief that drowned out the wind's relentless howl, a sound that seemed to seep into the very foundation of the place. Charles stood there, a statue of unrepentant fury, his broad shoulders squared, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline still coursing through him. The distant wail of sirens pierced the night, a sharp, insistent sound that grew louder as red and blue lights flashed through the frost-covered windows. Neighbors, alerted by the chaos, had called the police. The room seemed to close in, the air thickening with the weight of what had transpired, the musk of sweat and blood mingling with the cold draft that slipped through the open door. Evelyn rocked Marcus's lifeless form, her tears falling onto his face, tracing paths through the sweat and grime, her body racked with shudders, as the reality settled into her bones. Charles didn't move, didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the scene as if committing it to memory, a twisted victory he'd carry to his grave. The aftermath unfolded in a blur of flashing lights and cold steel, a chaotic tableau that swallowed the house whole, transforming it into a vortex of noise and shadow. Officers stormed through the front door, their heavy boots thudding against the weathered hardwood, each step reverberating like a drumbeat in the hollowed-out silence that followed Marcus's last breath. Their voices cut through the air, sharp, commanding, a cacophony of barked orders that clashed with the wind's mournful howl outside. Hands where we can see them, down now. Charles didn't resist, his broad frame slumping as they wrestled him to the ground, his knees hitting the floor with a dull thud that echoed the finality of what he'd done. His gray eyes, once alight with a fury that could scorch the earth, stared blankly ahead, vacant and unseeing, as if the fire within him had burned itself out at last. His hands, stained with Marcus's blood, a dark, glistening crimson that coated his fingers and pooled beneath his nails, hung limply at his sides, a mirror to the man he'd been decades ago, when he'd beaten a man bloody for less. His fists then as unrepentant as the knife had been tonight. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, a cold metallic sound that rang out in the stillness, sharp and final, like the closing of a coffin lid. They dragged him outside, his hulking form a silhouette against the swirling snow, his coat flapping in the gusts as he disappeared into the frozen night, swallowed by the flashing red and blue lights that painted the darkness in streaks of accusation. Evelyn sat on the porch, perched on the edge of a splintered wooden step, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket one of the officers had draped over her trembling shoulders. The fabric scratched against her skin, its rough weave a stark contrast to the softness of Marcus's touch. She could still feel ghosting over her body, her face was a mask of devastation, her pale cheeks streaked with tears that had dried into salty trails, her blue eyes once sharp and cutting, now dulled to a lifeless gray, reflecting the storm clouds overhead. Marcus's blood clung to her hands, still warm despite the biting chill, a sticky second layer of grief that seeped into her pores and stained her nightgown in irregular rust-colored patches. She stared at the ground, at the snowflakes melting into the blood-streaked boards beneath her, unable to lift her gaze to the chaos unfolding around her. The house behind her, once a refuge for their illicit love, a sanctuary of stolen kisses and whispered confessions, had become a tomb, its walls haunted by the echoes of their passion, the weight of her father's hate, and the indelible stain of a loss she'd carry forever. The wind, relentless and cruel, carried away the last of her sobs, scattering them into the frozen dark like ashes from a fire that had consumed everything she dared to hold dear, leaving only a deafening silence in its wake. In the days that followed, she buried Marcus in a quiet cemetery 30 miles south, a desolate patch of earth nestled between skeletal trees and frost-covered hills, beneath a sky as gray as her heart. The ground was hard with winter's grip, the soil unyielding as the gravediggers hacked at it with shovels that clanged against hidden stones, their breaths fogging in the frigid air. The mourners were few, just a handful of Marcus's friends. Young men with faces tight with sorrow and disbelief, their hands shoved deep into coat pockets, their eyes red-rimmed from tears they'd shed in private. They stood in a loose semicircle around the grave, their silence heavier than words, their dark coats blending into the gloom. Evelyn stood alone at the edge, apart from them, her black coat whipping in the wind, the hem frayed and mud-splattered from the trek across the uneven terrain. Her gray hair, tangled and uncombed, whipped across her face, obscuring the hollows of her cheeks, but she made no move to brush it aside. The coffin was simple, a plain pine box that creaked as it was lowered into the earth. the sound a quiet lament that pierced her chest like a second blade. She didn't speak, didn't cry, not then, her grief locked behind a wall of numbness. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the dried blood beneath her nails a secret she couldn't wash away. The store closed its doors in the weeks that followed, its windows dark and streaked with dust, the glass fogged with condensation that traced erratic paths down the panes. Inside, the shelves stood abandoned, gathering cobwebs that draped like mourning veils over the tools and hardware Marcus had once handled with care. Hammers he'd hung with precision, nails he'd counted under her watchful glare. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of rust and neglect, a monument to the life she'd shattered with her own hands. She couldn't bear to step inside, couldn't face the echoes of his quiet presence, the way he'd hum under his breath when he thought she wasn't listening, the way his hazel eyes had softened when they'd met hers in those fleeting, unguarded moments before everything had changed. The sign above the door, Carver's Hardware, swung crookedly in the wind, its paint peeling like the layers of her composure, a relic of a past she'd torched in her pursuit of a love she'd never fully understood. She didn't speak in court when Charles was sentenced, his fate sealed with the heavy fall of a judge's gavel. Life this time, no parole, a cell where the light couldn't reach, where the shadows would be his only company. The courtroom was cold, its high ceilings amplifying the murmurs of the sparse crowd. Reporters scribbling notes, a few curious locals drawn by the scandal, their whispers a low hum that buzzed in her ears. Charles sat motionless in the defendant's chair, his broad shoulders hunched, his gray hair lank against his scalp, his hands cuffed in front of him, still bearing faint traces of Marcus's blood beneath the nails. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the daughter he'd claimed to protect with his violence, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the judge's bench. Her silence was a testament to the void Marcus had left behind, a hollow space where her love and hate had once burned in equal measure, a fire that had flared bright and wild until it consumed them both. She'd loved him with a ferocity that terrified her, a passion that had clawed its way out of the darkness she'd buried it in, hated him for the mirror he held to her soul, reflecting back the ugliness she'd inherited, and wielded against him, lost him to a violence she couldn't undo, a blade that had severed more than just his life. It had cut her loose from everything she'd been. Now she lived in the ruins, her grief a shadow that clung to her like a second skin, a weight she'd carry until her own breath failed, a burden as relentless as the wind that rattled the empty store. The story ended there, in the ashes of their betrayal. A tale of a young man undone by a love he couldn't escape, his quiet strength no match for the hate that had hunted him. A woman torn apart by her own contradictions, her heart a battlefield where desire and prejudice had waged their war. And a father whose hate burned brighter than reason, a flame fed by a past he'd never outrun. Theirs was a fire that consumed them all, its flames licking at the edges of their lives until nothing remained but smoke and silence. A bitter elegy whispered on the wind that carried their names into oblivion.